Ralph Pribble. I work in the Public Information Office at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. I'm filling in for a colleague who is not able to be here tonight, so I have not previously been a part of this project. I'm just helping out, but I will be serving as moderator for the meeting tonight. I want to thank you all for coming out. As you know, you're here to hear some information about the Area C on the Mississippi River. In a few minutes, we're going to hear from some speakers, and they've got a presentation for you, followed by Q&A, which I believe, if I'm right, is followed by an open house, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, so somebody lost something here? Looks like a hat that says craft on the front of it. We'll have it up here if it's yours. Just a reminder of how things work. Washrooms are across the gallery over here. We're going to ask during the presentation, which hopefully is no longer than half an hour, if you could, to the extent possible, hold your questions during the presentation, because it allows us to get through it quicker so that we can then get on to the questions that we know everybody has. Another thing is we are going to try something with questions tonight. We have note cards that will be made available to you, and we're asking, David's got them back there, we're going to have other people roaming around offering them over on the side here. We've got pens for you. If you could, please write your questions on the note cards and pass them to the folks who will be wandering around collecting them for you. The reason we do this is because we find at meetings like these that we get a lot of questions that can be duplicative. And what we do is we take the note cards that we get and we group them together into questions that are similar, and then we address them as sort of a group question. It helps us to get to many more questions. It sounds kind of controlling, but really the intent is to try to get to as many questions as possible without duplicating the questions. So having said that, we'll do that, but we'll also leave time for people to speak aloud before the group who want to. So we'll start with questions on the note cards, then when we've gotten through most of those, we'll go to the people raising their hands basically. And I don't know whether we'll need a microphone or not. That's a little difficult because we don't have cordless microphones, but we'll make it work so that everybody hears the questions. So with that said, open house begins at...
Well, it's not really an open house, Ralph. I mean, we're here, the meeting goes till 8, so 6 to 8, so we'll...
Meeting goes till 8?
As long as people have questions.
Yeah, and so we're trying to accommodate basically presentation questions and being able to speak one-on-one or in small groups with staff who are here. We're trying to cover all those bases tonight. And we have till 8 o'clock to do that. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Amy, and you can introduce yourself, Amy.
Hey, well, thank you everybody for coming. Does everybody have an available seat? I hope you haven't run out of chairs. I know there was more to set up back there if needed. Did you? Okay, thanks. So my name is Amy Hattie-Harris. I'm a hydrogeologist with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. Been working on the Fort site since 2007. I can't believe it's been that long. But we're still plugging away at it here in the last segment. Done with the main parcel, and now we're back on the river parcel to finish up Area C. I wanted to just mention one other thing about the note cards with the questions. It helps us capture all the information because we do want to post the questions on our webpage as well. So it helps kind of capture the comments and questions so that we can do that after the meeting. Okay. So with no further ado, I'm going to start through this presentation. I call this a community information meeting because we're not at a decision point for Area C. But we did have a request from the Friends of Mississippi River and the Capital Region Watershed District. They said they've been getting a lot of questions about the investigation and the environmental status out there. And I said, we don't get questions. Why does nobody call us? Because we're there for you if you want to. But anyways, because of that, they thought it would be a good time to have a public information meeting. So that's what this is. I got about 20 slides, give or take, just kind of going through a little bit of the history, the investigation that's been done out there to date, and then what the next steps are so that you have a better understanding of the context that we're operating in. So just to orient yourself, Here, of course, is the main parcel before all the buildings were demolished, is now a vacant site, of course. But today our attention is going to turn right down here to the river parcel, and in particular Area C, which is this part of the river parcel right there. And just a really general overview. So Area C is located at the base of the bluff on the floodplain. It's a spot where Ford disposed of paint sludge and solvents that were used in their painting processes from the 1940 to the mid-1960s. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that, wrong one. From the investigation that we did, and I'll be showing that to you shortly, we know that the industrial waste on average is about 25 feet thick beneath that parking lot. And then it's overlain and surrounded by about 40 to 60 feet of soil on top of it. And then that in turn is surrounded by these super big blocks of concrete that came from the lock and dam when it was reconstructed in the 1970s. And then that whole thing is covered by that concrete parking lot. And some of you may be familiar with that concrete parking lot because I know during the State Fair, they use it as a park and ride, a free park and ride. So you've been on top of Area C and you didn't even know it. So here's a kind of a close-up aerial view. If you have parked on there, somebody was asking me before the meeting, trying to orient themselves. The pointer button is right next to the arrow for the slides. So here's Mississippi River Boulevard. If you were going to park on that parking lot, you know, it's kind of a sharp turn right here, and then you turn in here. So a lot of people might have been on this area. So from the investigation that we did, and I'll show you those borings in a minute, we know that the footprint of the industrial waste is kind of outlined by this orange line here. So it's not under the whole parking lot. It kind of is in this footprint here. And as you'll see from future slides, which has some contours for the topography, as you move away from the parking lot there, it's really steep slopes, you know, all around here. It slopes off very steeply. So when did we find out? And the MPCA found out about Area C in October of 1980, so that goes back a ways. It was an anonymous phone call, probably with somebody that worked there since it was an anonymous phone call. But during the 1950s, this is a quote from the notes that the person that took the call wrote, so it's part of our paper file. But during the 1950s, near the Ford plant, waste solvents from the plant's painting operation were dumped over the steep bluff overlooking the river, and waste in barrels was buried. And this is a major complicating factor for our Area C investigation and cleanup plan. So back in the late 1970s, the Army Corps of Engineers reconstructed the lock and dam there, the Ford lock and dam. And so they dredged up a lot of the soil, the sediment from the river and all the sand, and that was placed on top of the industrial waste. So there's at least 40 to 60 feet of dredged material on top and around it. And then that's where the big, huge concrete blocks came from. If you've been down there or saw the video that FMR has on their website, you can see some of those big concrete blocks. They're like the size of like a car or something. They're pretty big. And so those actions make the industrial waste difficult to access and remove. So early regulatory history, we found out about it in 1980, and of course at that time, since the lock and dam stuff was placed in the late 70s, it had already been kind of covered up, so it made it a little bit more difficult to see what was going on. But they did some groundwater monitoring in the early days from 1981 to 1990. There was about 5 or 6 monitoring wells down there on the river parcel. No significant impact was detected at that time. In 1984, the Ford site was listed on the state Superfund list. That was actually when our state Superfund list began in 1984. We had about 90 sites go on the Superfund list at the same time on that first listing. Ford site was one of them. And it wasn't just for Area C. It was really there was some other stuff going on in the main parcel that needed to be looked at too. So that was the impetus for putting the Ford site on the state Superfund list. Over the next 6 or 7 years or so, some investigation happened on the main parcel, some additional poking around on the river parcel for Area C. They did a limited surface cleanup at Area C, kind of cleaning up a little bit what they could access, because most of it was buried by that lock and dam stuff, but a limited surface cleanup, and then a little bit of erosion control. And then in 1993, the Ford site was removed from the state Superfund list. So that was the end of that era, and then we fast forward about 23 years to the current investigation, because everything just kind of, the plant was operating. It wasn't until 2007 when Ford contacted the MPCA with their plans for closing the property, closing the plant, and wanting to do an environmental investigation to kind of prepare it for redevelopment. So we started working with Ford back in 2007. And at that time, they did a lot of main parcel work. They also did a little bit on Area C, but it was our position, even though Area C and the river parcel isn't part of the redevelopment, we indicated to Ford that this is the time that we take a fresh look at that area. Yes, we looked at it back in the early 1980s, but conditions change, our analytical methods change, our tools change. So we wanted them to take a fresh look at that, so we had them do this investigation. And in 2015 and 2016, that was when they did a lot of field work down here, and I'm going to just go over what that is. So they did 10 soil borings through the top of the parking lot. Each gold dot is a soil boring with the drill rig, and they drill down. And so each of those soil borings ended up being about 80 to 95 feet deep, because you're way up, the parking lot's way up. And then they got to go down through all that construction fill until they reached the waste. And then they went all the way through the waste until they reached the native floodplain materials below the waste. So that was how we could kind of figure out what the thickness of the waste is in this area of the parking lot. I would just point out that it's way too steep. Here you can see some of those contour lines, the topography. It's way too steep to drill in these areas. You can't get a rig on that. So the drilling was limited to the parking lot. And so what we found was that, and this is where the footprint of the waste comes from that I've been showing you on the different slides. These are the soil borings in which the industrial waste was encountered at depth. And then these soil borings, there was nothing. It was just construction fill all the way down with no contamination. So observations, this is just field observations from looking at the stuff in the field, starting at about 50 to 60 feet down. That's when we encountered this black, smelly soil with glass and metal mixed in and whatnot. And it had a strong solvent odor, the solvents that were used in that painting operation. And so here we have just kind of a visual. If you cut this in half, like this, and then go off to the side and look back at it, like cutting the layer cake in half, you're looking at it from the side here. This is just kind of a schematic presentation of what it is with the industrial waste in this area, the black smelly soil here, overlaying by all this construction fill. Here's the bluff, here's Mississippi River Boulevard up here, here's the river. The investigation also included some trenches cut into the, cut into the south slope. That's what these green bars are. These are test trenches because, again, we couldn't drill in this area. And then some transects for collecting just surface soil samples. And so the observations in the field here were that in this area here, we encountered some paint sludge and crushed barrels about 2 feet below the ground surface, just in those trenches. And that kind of makes sense too with some historical information that we have. I should point out that there's no records or documentation about how these wastes were disposed or when, other than some notes on the back of a napkin kind of thing. I mean, people just didn't keep records back then in the 40s, 50s, and 60s about what they were doing with their waste. But there is like an old map that somebody drew by hand at some point, we don't even know who, that kind of indicates that this area here is an older disposal area, and that this area here is like a younger disposal area. So I think the older disposal area is kind of where the barrels were put, and anyways, we know that they're here anyways, because we saw some of that with the trenching operation. So the waste and soil sampling, I just listed here kind of an overview of the samples that we collected. So we collected samples for laboratory analysis from the buried industrial waste, the black sticky soil stuff, and then the overlying construction fill, and then the surface soil on the slopes. And those samples were analyzed for like a whole lot of stuff. Each of these categories includes 65 chemicals, the volatile organic compounds is a list of about 65 or so chemicals. Those are chemicals that they include all your solvents and gasoline chemicals and stuff like that, and they call them volatile organic compounds because they volatilize very quickly in the air if they're exposed to the air. Then these semi-VOCs, that's probably a list of about 80 or so compounds. Again, they're organic compounds, a whole list that they run at the same time. 23 metals, diesel range organics and gasoline range organics, usually associated with petroleum, but they can come from other sources as well. And then the waste samples were also analyzed for PCBs. So we covered a lot of bases there in terms of what we were testing these samples for. And then the results of the waste and soil samples. The buried waste, we found high concentrations, and this is pretty expected actually, high concentrations of VOCs from the paint solvents. And the solvents that they used at the site were not chlorinated solvents. They were like the same kind of compounds or chemicals that you find in gasoline, like benzene and toluene and that kind of thing, if that means anything to you. There's also a lot of high concentrations of certain metals. And the reason the metals are there is because the automobile paints had metals in them for pigment. So different color paints had different metals. That's what gives it the color. So that's kind of where the metals come from. The specific metals for different colors, and then the lead is prevalent. So prevalent because lead was added to all the paints because that increased the durability. The lead wasn't a color additive, but it increases the durability of the paint. So that's why you have a lot of lead everywhere. Low concentration of PCBs. But probably from the paint pigment, I'm just guessing there because I know that historically sometimes that was added to paint to increase plasticity, but that's just from some research I did. There's no forward notes on that. And then polynuclear aromatic hydrocarbons, again a kind of heavier organic compound that are typically associated with petroleum. They're found in asphalt, and they're also produced by incomplete combustion of burning materials, and there was some burning of waste materials. I'll get into that a little bit later. And then I would point out that lead, there's a special test that is done. If a waste is going to go to a mixed municipal landfill nowadays, they require a test to see if it would leach hazardous for their disposal purposes. And so when that test is done on the samples, and lead sometimes came back as characteristically hazardous, which means that it would need special treatment if it was going to a mixed municipal solid waste landfill because of the acidity of that environment. Over here we got the construction fill and the surface soil. There was some low-level PAHs and kind of DRO, petroleum kind of compounds. Really just levels that are typical of urban fill containing road debris. Almost every site that comes through our cleanup program finds these kind of things. They're prevalent from our roads and stormwater runoff and all kinds of things. So really the material that is of concern is the buried waste. The investigation also, we kind of got kicked off our groundwater investigation out there. There was 2 wells already put in by Ford as part of the wider site investigation on the main parcel. They had also put down 2 wells down here. As part of this investigation, they added 8 more, so that brings our total to 10 monitoring wells, each represented by a blue dot. When they're close together like that, that just means that there's 2 wells at that spot that terminate at different depths in the aquifer, so that allows us to grab a groundwater sample from different depths, which is handy. And then the groundwater sampling, which is ongoing, the groundwater samples were analyzed pretty much for that same list of things. Cyanide as well, because that could be part of a blue paint component. But the wells are sampled quarterly, but during flood events, we go to monthly sampling, because during flood events, that really changes the whole dynamic down there on the river parcel. The water table rises and falls quickly with the river, in tandem with the river, I should say. It can change the flow direction, and so there was a desire to see, well, how does that then affect, the water quality sampling results that we're getting. So quarterly sampling, except monthly during flood events, and I think back in 2019, last year, the river was high a lot, so I think they did monthly sampling for like 7 or 8 months or something like that. It was a lot of data coming in. So the results are, in particular, the well near the bluff on the south slope. That's where we see the most consistent contamination. We do see some VOCs in that water reflecting the solvents, and cobalt, shows up a little bit there too. So the main issue with the groundwater sampling, based on the data that we have now, is kind of off that south slope where the trenches encountered that shallow waste that I mentioned. The other wells, kind of intermittent detections of contaminants, like you might see something one time, it doesn't show up the next time. So it's kind of hit or miss. But all the concentrations are much less that would pose a risk to the river. So we do have a process, for evaluating, is this groundwater contamination posing a risk to the river? We have a kind of a set process for doing that that's laid out in our guidance, and that's the process that we use. This was posted on the back there, so some of you may have seen this. The reason I wanted to bring this up here again is because I wanted to show how the river rising and falling affects the water table, or the water table on Area C. So here's the river, and a normal river stage, this is the water table. But what we did, we put in, normally when a groundwater sample is collected, they go out there and they do a manual measurement of the water level. But we wanted like more real-time data to see how the water table changes in response to rising and falling river stages. So we had Ford put in continuous water level monitoring devices in, I think it's either 4 or 5 wells. And so those run continuously, got a little floater in there, it's all hooked up to a computer thing, and then they download the data. So you can see, the hydrograph, you can see the levels go up and down continuously. And what we find is that it's almost a direct correlation, with the river. So when the river rises, so does the water table in the parcel there. And this is the 10-year flood, the 50-year flood, and the 100-year flood. So you can see that the water table underneath Area C, underneath the waste, actually rises up into the bottom portion of that waste. So that's one of the reasons why we went to that monthly sampling during flood events, was to make sure that we can capture any like slugs or something that come through as a result of that contact. Hasn't resulted in any notable detections at this point yet, to be honest. There's probably a few reasons for that, which I can go into in a little bit, but so far the data has not indicated a very significant impact to groundwater. The next steps, so we got 10 wells down there now. Friends of Mississippi and the Capital Region Watershed District provided some feedback on the monitoring network, and they were interested in having, or to expanding the monitoring network down there to include some wells in the St. Peter, which is the first bedrock aquifer. So we have worked with Ford to get that going, and in 2020, as soon as we get the permitting figured out and stuff, some new wells are going to go down on Area C. There's going to be 9 additional wells. A couple of them are going to be in the shallow aquifer, but there's also going to be some wells in the St. Peter. And they're going to be tested for that same long list of compounds that I already mentioned. So that'll bring the number of wells to 19 on that area. It's not a very big area. That's a lot of wells. So I think we're going to have a really good database by which to evaluate these groundwater impacts, both horizontally and vertically. Before we make a decision on cleanup, we want to have all of this data available, because when we do make a cleanup decision, we want it to reflect a good investigation of both soil and groundwater. So before we make a cleanup decision, we are gonna be waiting for these wells to go in, and we want at least 2 flood events, so that we can capture that seasonal variation. So there's not a cleanup, I say this because so you know that there's not a cleanup decision pending, because we want this data before we make a cleanup decision. Another thing that was requested was to test the groundwater for PFAS compounds, which you guys probably have all heard of PFAS. Those are the 3M kind of chemicals that have been in the news a lot. The connection with the Ford plant would be a plating operation that they had on the main parcel. So most of us remember the Ford plant as being an assembly plant for the Ford Ranger, but before that, of course, they were manufacturing cars and they were painting cars, and they had a plating operation in the main building. So there's a little bit of an overlap there. Of course, they had the plating operation from the time they started, I'm sure, manufacturing cars until they converted to the assembly plant, which was, I think, in 1977, they started producing trucks. So let's say the mid-70s. The connection with PFAS compounds would be sometimes plating operations have like a vapor suppression foam, over the solvent bin that they're using. And those foams, I think, started being used for that purpose in the 1960s. So there might have been like a 10 to 12, 15-year max overlap between the availability of these PFAS foams and the plating operations at the Ford site. We do not know if Ford used those vapor suppression foams. They did not have any data available or information available to say yes or no. So just as a precautionary measure, we asked Ford to sample their wells for PFAS, not only down here, but they also collected some data on the main parcel to kind of serve as background information. So that data will be coming in as well. A note about that, there's been a lot of newspaper coverage about PFAS compounds, and if you've been following that, you will know that they're everywhere. Everywhere, at least at low concentrations, it seems. I mean, it seems like if you look for them, we find them. And so, do you, yeah, did you have anything to add about that, Hans? Okay, yeah, so it's likely, even if they find some down here, that doesn't necessarily mean they're coming from Area C. So I just want to kind of prepare people to think it's not just about looking at a number and something's detected. It's about analyzing that data and putting it into context with what we know about the site and the history and just the environmental condition as a whole in our wider network of monitoring for this compound. So the path forward, this is just an overview of next steps. This is also in the back if you want a closer look after the meeting. But we're here still. We're still here at the investigation stage. So where is the contamination? That's what we've got some wells in, we're putting more wells in. And what are the risks? So that's where we're at now. After the investigation is done, we go to we call it a feasibility study, which is kind of a funky word it's a very certain kind of document in which cleanup alternatives are evaluated. So in other words, in this kind of process, Ford won't come back to us and say, here's what we want to do. We require a more contemplative process, to get us to that endpoint. And so the feasibility study says, well, you need to evaluate a bunch of different alternatives, and you need to evaluate each of those alternatives against a set number and type of criteria, so that people can have an idea, okay, well, how much is that going to cost, and how does that address this risk, and what's the permanence of that remedy? So there's all these criteria that are set, and each alternative needs to be evaluated accordingly. So the reason, it's a super fun kind of document. On a traditional Superfund site, that's what they would do. This isn't being handled as a Superfund site, but we're just following that same process because I think it's a way to be more transparent about what the cleanup alternatives were or are going to be leading up to the final choice, so people will know. When we get that feasibility study, then we're going to have another community meeting, just like this one, where we will provide an overview of those cleanup options, and then that kicks off a 30-day comment period. So the meeting, we'll introduce them, we'll give you an overview, and then after that meeting, we can have a 30-day comment period so the community can weigh in on that. It's not uncommon for a feasibility study to be revised. I mean, even just based on MPCA review and feedback, but let alone feedback from the community as well. Some examples of how it might be revised would be including more detail on an alternative that's already in there. It might be adding an alternative that maybe wasn't thought of before. So there's a lot of kind of back and forth as we work through cleanup alternatives. Then the feasibility study will be revised as needed, and then it falls to the MPCA to select the cleanup plan. I mean, that is our responsibility. So we take into account a lot of different things. Some of these different things are listed on the poster in the back. I took it off this slide because it just got too busy and too small, and I couldn't fit it all on there. But the poster on the back has not only this arrow with the process, but it has a chunk underneath it, and that shows all the different criteria that we use to evaluate the different cleanup options. And at this point, I will say too, I don't want to get too much into the feasibility study. I'm giving you an overview of where we're going to go with it, but we don't have it yet, and we're not going to have it for at least a year, I imagine. But every feasibility study has a no action alternative. In other words, it's going to have, well, here's our first option. We're not going to do anything. That doesn't mean that they're not going to do anything. It's just like a benchmark so that they can compare everything to that alternative. It's like a bookend, right? So they're actually required to have a no action alternative. A no action alternative would never be chosen because if no action was an option, they wouldn't be doing the feasibility study in the first place. But it's in there for a reason. It's to provide a benchmark for comparison with the other alternatives. And then Ford implements a cleanup plan. So based on what we know at this time, we know certain things about what needs to be done out there. We know that there needs to be some excavation on the south slope where there was paint sludge and crushed barrels 2 feet below the ground surface, and that's also the area where there's some groundwater impacts. There's a lot of physical hazards out there. If you ever walked around down there or just looked over the fence, whatever, you can see there's rusty metal, there's a lot of surface debris. So that's kind of it's not related to the contamination, but it is a risk. Physical hazards are a risk as well. So that needs to be kind of cleaned up too. Make sure there's a clean soil buffer on the slopes. And there's a significant erosion problem out there, so slope stabilization. So we know that needs to happen. The final scope of work will be determined after additional wells are installed and at least 1 more year of groundwater monitoring. I'm going to capture some seasonal variation there. So, I just want to give you an idea about what we know needs to happen now based on the data that we have, but we're not making a final determination because the additional data might show another issue that needs to be addressed by additional work. Reopeners, any cleanup decision we make in the future will be based on the current condition of Area C. We always have reopeners. Ford is a responsible party. They're always going to be a responsible party. So we can reopen at any time. If conditions change, for example, if we get new information, if there's a change in groundwater quality, because they're going to be required to continue to monitor the groundwater if any waste remains, or if the removal of the lock and dam. Some of you may be familiar with that issue. It's possible that the lock and dam may be removed at some point. That's certainly going to change the dynamics of the river. So that could have an effect on Area C. So any of these things are reopeners, and we just take a fresh look at it and go from there. So it's not a forever decision, but it's going to be based on the existing conditions that exist at this time. But in the meantime, folks want to know, we know from some of the questions we got that there's some concern about health impacts based on the current conditions. So we asked the Minnesota Department of Health to do an independent assessment of risk to public health down at Area C based on the current conditions. They finished that. It is posted on our website. We did have a summary. They provided us with a full 8-page memo, which is on our website, and then they provided us with a 2-page summary, which is probably more handy for people that don't want to read a bunch of technical stuff. But they're both posted on our website, and the 2-page summary we provided here tonight. But the conclusion is that there's minimal risks if trespassers contact those surface contaminants in the soil, the PAHs and the petroleum type thing, and the physical hazards. But in terms of the industrial waste, there's really no way for people to come in contact with that buried waste or be exposed to harmful amounts of contaminants. So what this means is, it doesn't mean that no cleanup is needed. It just means that it's not an emergency situation. We don't have to have an emergency removal here to make it safe for people in the river. It allows us the time to continue the investigation and do the work that's needed so that we can make a decision when all the information is available. And that is the end of my presentation. I hope it answered some questions, but I know that we do have other questions. At this point, I'm going to give the mic back to Ralph, but he's going to be moderator for the questions.
Thank you, Amy. So as I mentioned, we've got these note cards. If you've got note cards, we've got folks who are walking around collecting them. They're going to bring them up. They're going to sort them into groups and then bring them up here. So while we're getting that underway, in the meantime, we had some people who did contact us by email with questions ahead of time in the past few days. And I was wondering if we could, Amy, do you have those with you where we could start with a couple of those? And we also, I want to mention, we have other staff from the MPCA and from the Department of Health who no doubt will be called upon to answer questions, and they'll introduce themselves when they come up. So the first question we had here was, has any work been done, and please be sending up your note card, has any work been done close to the river with temporary wells or direct push sampling to evaluate the potential flux of contaminants via the surface aquifer to the river and shallow groundwater? Maybe you want to say in plain language what that means. You kind of addressed it.
I think somebody asked that question who has an environmental background. And actually, in preparation, it was nice getting some of these questions ahead of time because I was able to kind of put an extra figure after the end of the presentation by way to answer the questions. So that was Bill. Thank you for your question, Bill. So I think that Bill was talking about the distribution of monitoring wells here, and if Bill's here, he can clarify, but I think maybe what he's referring to is there's kind of a gap here in the down, so here's the river, the down gradient just means which way the groundwater is flowing, and he was contemplating perhaps that this is a big gap here, and maybe that there should be a well here to plug that hole. So I think what I wanted to point out was that we do have this well right here that does capture that flow pathway. And this is really a well-positioned well. It's right off the toe of the waste at the water table. So that's really well-positioned to capture any contamination that's coming off that waste mass. If we put it here, like if we didn't have this here and we put it here, it would already be, any groundwater impact would probably already be pretty diluted. So we like having it up here because it's a lot closer to the waste. I hope that answers the question. I do want to point out, since we're talking about monitoring well spacing, it's kind of unusual to have wells all around the area here. I mean, this is a site, it's a fairly small site overall, but there's monitoring wells on all sides, and that's kind of unusual, but here it's necessary because the groundwater flow direction does change over time because of the influence of the river going up and down. Sometimes we even get reversals of groundwater flow temporarily. All the groundwater underneath Area C eventually ends up in the river, but it can kind of go back and forth, and so it's not a setting where I would expect to find like a really narrow defined plume. It's going to kind of spread out over time. So that's why there's wells on all sides.
Thanks, Amy. Again, cards, written questions to our collectors here, and if the collectors could begin sorting and grouping those and then bring them up as you've got a reasonable group assembled. Here's another question that was emailed to us a couple days ago. Assuming the MPCA decides to permit Ford's waste to remain in place, will the MPCA require Ford to provide financial assurance? I won't read the whole thing, it's a little bit long. So what if not, what assurance can Ford and the MPCA provide to the community that adequate funds will be available? And I believe Hans was going to take that one. So Hans, maybe you could say who you are.
Yeah, hello, my name is Hans Navy. I'm a program manager at Pollution Control Agency. This is a question about If more work is needed in the future, how will we be assured that we're able to do that work? So as Amy talked about, we're following a prescribed process. It's laid out by the Superfund process, Superfund law. As it turns out, I'm going to say Superfund is the most powerful environmental law in the books. And the reason for that is because the scope of the liability is vast. So, yes, it may be that the cleanup decision that's made is not a forever decision. So it's very rare that we need the sort of financial assurance that's talked about. The process has certain backstops and assurances that will allow us to continue to work on this site if needed. So right now, we're not planning a financial assurance something. We don't think it's needed because we have other tools that can get us to the end point that we need. But again, the decision we're making is not a forever decision. It's a decision based on the information we have today, and today it's not needed.
Thanks, Hans. Another emailed question to us, and we'll get to those cards in a few minutes here. That has to deal, it's somewhat along the same lines of what Hans was talking about. This person wants to know is there a legally binding document that the MPCA can use to ensure that Ford meets its obligations in the future? And how can the MPCA assure the community that they'll remain accountable? And Shanna is gonna take that one.
Shauna. It's spelled funny. Shauna Schmidt. I'm with the PCA. I'm in the remediation division. I work with Amy on brownfield sites. I also work on the Superfund sites. So our main tool for long-term monitoring and obligations is called an environmental covenant and easement document. It's a legally binding document that Ford and the MPCA would sign. It requires some land use restrictions. It requires affirmative obligations to keep the cap intact or whatever slope stability stuff intact, keep it adequately covered, stuff like that. It would be common. And it also includes some restrictions. When I said land use restrictions, I mean like you can't have residential, or you can only use it for recreational, stuff like that. It can be vague, like residential, recreational, or it can be very specific. So I know there are some other questions we'll get to about some of the proposed land uses for the top, that parking lot of Area C. The other thing about the environmental covenant and easement, it's legally enforceable, so if something isn't being done, the PCA has the authority and the obligation to work with Ford or take legal action to get things sorted out. That doesn't really happen usually, but we can do it. It also requires an annual compliance report. Sometimes they're short, sometimes they're long, but we have many sites that have these documents, so this wouldn't be anything unique to Ford. It's something we're well equipped to handle. So those are kind of the tools. That's the biggest tool that we would use for that long-term legal agreement, and then there would be long-term monitoring, like Amy said earlier, about the groundwater wells in that area.
Thanks, Shanna. And one more, and then we'll see if we've got some grouping on our questions yet, where we can begin to address your written questions. This questioner who emailed us says that Area C is a fenced-off toxic time bomb, and that that they fear that the issue will boil down to cost, and that the cheapest thing will be done, not necessarily what's right. Amy, I think, has an answer to that one.
Thanks, yeah, so, I think the question, part of the question too was a multi-part question. Why isn't the MPCA and the county and city demanding Ford to clean up this dump? I'd say we are doing that, but by going through the process that we have for doing a thorough investigation and then making a cleanup decision based on that data. I mean, that is the way we handle all of the sites, and that's the process that we're following here. So I think it's not to look back and condone that what waste was disposed in this way, but that is the way that our society disposed of waste back in that time. This was before there were any laws about waste disposal. There was no rules or regulations, and basically dumping along rivers or just in a gravel pit, that's how everybody got rid of their waste. And so thank goodness we've come a long way since then. But we are having to deal with these old sites that predated our environmental regulations. And the first substantive waste management legislation wasn't passed until 1976. And so again, this goes back all the way to 1940. So that waste has been there for, as up to 80 years. We don't consider it to be a ticking time bomb. I know that it's can be kind of a scary mental picture for folks, hearing about the waste that's there. But again, that waste has been there for a very long time. It's been, before it was covered by all this construction material, I'm fairly certain that there was a significant environmental impact to the river when this waste was being disposed. You had probably solvents being dumped right on the floodplain. They probably had a direct connection to the river. I can't imagine that that wouldn't have impacted the river. And then barrels of paint sludge buried down there, probably not even buried too well, probably even maybe being at the surface, exposed to flooding events and whatnot. Again, I would be shocked if there wasn't an impact to the river back in those days. Thinking back on the figure that showed the water level rising and falling, we could see that before all that construction material was placed from the lock and dam reconstruction, that waste pile would have been flooded and rain would have been falling on it and stuff. So there's been, I'm sure that was a time of environmental impact to the river. The current situation is not quite like that. With all that fill material placed, it's more encapsulated, it's not getting precipitation. We do still see the water table rising up into it, and we're monitoring the groundwater to see how that affects. But again, the environmental impact that happened in the past is not the environmental impact that's happening now. So the decision that we make is based on the data that we collect at the end of this investigation process. Yeah, sure.
Just based on some of the questions we've got on the cards, how would suspect materials or waste materials be treated if Ford was trying to dispose of these materials in 2020? And so if Ford were operating and creating that sort of waste that was disposed of in the past, right now it would go to an industrial landfill, a permitted landfill by our closed landfill program.
Thanks. This is a health question. This person emailed us to say that she leads a weekly gathering of preschoolers at Hidden Falls, and she's concerned about the children's safety. They often play where the creek meets the river in Area C. Do we know if it's safe to play in the water? And if we don't know, how can we get an answer? Emily.
I just want to pull up that map.
Hi, I'm Emily Hansen. I'm a health assessor at the Minnesota Department of Health. I think this is a really great question. I have a 6-year-old, and we've been walking around the loop at Hidden Falls ever since he was been able to walk. But we've never actually considered playing in the creek, and I don't think I've seen kids play in the creek. So I think this is a really great question. So I haven't really thought about it. The creek itself is south of Area C. There's really no reason, it doesn't go through Area C, there's really no reason the Area C would impact the creek, but it is a stormwater outfall, stormwater drainage area, and it's been that way for a long time. It was actually used as a discharge point from the Ford plant long ago, and so that water that's coming to the creek now, my understanding is it's a lot of stormwater runoff. We do have some data, I asked Amy for some data, looked at it today. There was some impact to that back in the 80s from spills from the main Ford plant. The last data that we have is from 2010. There's no reason to be concerned about the water from that 2010 sampling. But it's still kind of it's a question of stormwater runoff and how great is that. So I've been aware that there's people that are looking at improving the stormwater runoff infrastructure, especially with the new development. And so for the goal of improving the water quality in that creek, and of course then the water quality goes out to the river from that. So it's a question that I think I'm going to look into a little bit more and try to get a better, more thorough response to that question.
Sean, are we ready for some of the written questions yet?
There's a lot of choices, guys. Thanks for having so many categories. So, two of the cards reference ecological risk. So one question specifically was about the rusty patched bumblebee, and then just other animals and birds in particular. And so what risk is there to them? We did talk with the city of St. Paul. We talked to them a lot actually, but specifically about some documents they had in their master plan for Hidden Falls Park and Crosby Park. And they have a area in the northern part of Hidden Falls Park, so just south of Area C, that is it's called like a high impact plant vegetation area. And so that basically means that there's some plants that are beneficial to the whole ecosystem in that area. It is on the floodplain. What we know from talking with the city and doing site visits at Area C and in the park is that it's not, at least the stuff on Area C, it's not a prime habitat for bumblebees. There aren't lots of pollinator flowers. There's not a lot of stuff that they're going to be into. Rusty patch bumblebees can extend into that area, most definitely. So that's something to consider in future plantings, both at Area C and in Hidden Falls Park. Birds, sort of the same thing. They're eating insects that are definitely in the shallow soil zone. We don't see a lot of contamination in the shallow soils. Most of it is covered up by the construction debris and then of course the cap on top. So I hope that answers the general theme of those questions. And I have another one, if I can pick on Amy. We'll go to another theme regarding some of the more science. What is underneath Area C? I think you answered some of this in your presentation, but are there linear or impervious layers within Area C? What's the typical geology, soils in that area? And is there any horizontal or vertical permeability in those layers?
I'm very impressed. So, it's right on top of the floodplain. It's like sand. It's like sand and gravel down there. It probably was like an old point bar or something back in the day before it got filled with fill material and construction debris. So there's really not any there's not any horizontal layers that are gonna cause contaminated groundwater, kind of switch directions or whatever. I mean, any contamination from the Area C waste is just gonna go down. It's gonna go down into the groundwater, and then it's gonna flow easily through those underlying sediments, which are just basically sand and gravel, into the river.
Yes.
Well, sure we do.
There was a tank leaking at the Coke refinery. For many years, the aviation gas tank, they didn't notice how slowly it was leaking. And they built some test wells around the refinery, and they found a foot of gasoline on the water table. And they did months of studies and modeling, and they said, oh, it'll never come out of the riverbank. 3 months later, it came out of the riverbank. So you can't know what's under there and say it's all sand. There's all kinds of layers of limestone in this area.
Well, no, that's not, I appreciate your comment, but, every site is very different, and when we're talking about sites up on the bluff, it's very much more complicated. But this is on the floodplain, it's on the sand and gravel. I mean, there's no limestone or anything under here, we're down below that. The only thing is it's sand, and then underneath that it's a St. Peter sandstone. So it's a really different hydrogeologic setting. We don't have those kind of barriers at this spot.
Thanks. Shauna, have you got another group to address here? And I might also say, if there's somebody back there who's got a card, hold up your cards, or collectors will get them from you and bring them forward. It's about 5 minutes to 7. We'll probably go another, say, 20 minutes with these cards, and then we'll switch to anybody who has anything to say. Okay? Shauna?
some of this is the future plans for ARC and how that comes into the investigation work. So I've heard of plans to install solar panels on the site, meaning Area C, without clearing the site, and I'm assuming that means without removing the waste material. How does this fit in with the investigation that's been going on? So the solar panel idea has been floated. We know about it. We've heard about it. The plan, as it sits now, would just be to have solar arrays surface mounted. So there's going to be no footings drilled in through the concrete cap. It would just sit on that concrete part, not the slopes. And they're movable in case they needed to be moved. That's the plan we've heard so far. So if something like that were to happen, that wouldn't affect our remedy, whatever that final cleanup plan remedy is. Certainly surface activities like that could happen. It's a very light, non-destructive activity to do on the surface. How will removing the dam impact Area C? I think Amy touched on that a little bit in her presentation. So removing the dam changes the flow of the river and the dynamics of the river. So it can affect water level, it can affect how wide the river gets and how much erosion can happen along the banks and whether those banks are stabilized or not. So that's, it's a good question. It's not something we're spending a lot of time exploring right now.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to mention too that if it does come time for that lock and dam to be removed, that's a really major effort, and that there would, you know, the regulations would call, the federal regulations would call for an environmental impact statement, and that's kind of one of the things that they would look at that time.
Yep. The only other thing I have to add to that is it could affect the kind of flooding levels that are set right now. You know, there's certain levels we think of as 30-year flood, 50-year flood, 100-year flood. And some of that might change too, and that would be looked at that time. I have one for Hans. What happens if Ford goes bankrupt?
What happens if Ford goes bankrupt? A big part of this is a legal question. There's different kinds of bankruptcy. I'm not an attorney, so I'm going to steer away from the legal part of it. That's one part of the answer. What happens if Ford goes bankrupt? The other part of it is the process is a backstop for that. So there's different ways we do this work. One is responsible parties identified, and we work with them and give them direction or oversight under the work. That's what's happening here. Ford's a responsible party, and we are overseeing them, giving them direction. There are some kinds of sites, some kinds of contamination we find. We discover them, then we discover the entities that are responsible are either no longer around or don't have the fund to do it. There's a backstop for that. There's it's called a fund finance site. So it's paid with money that the state has, or if it's a federal site, what the federal government has. So it may not come to that. This is a sort of a specific legal question where the details are important. In any case, there's a backstop. So the environment is protected.
Thanks, Hans. Well, Sean is organizing there. To take another one of these questions that was emailed. This person wants to make sure that, how do we know that the water monitoring results are accurate and complete and not biased by self-interest? This is a question we get a lot wherever we have responsible parties arranging for and paying for and doing the sampling. And Amy can answer that one. How do we make sure the results are accurate and not biased by self-interest?
Sure, thanks. So Ford never has his hands on the samples. I mean, that's for sure. They, every responsible party that's doing an investigation, they hire a professional environmental engineering firm to kind of do that work on their behalf. So Arcadis is Ford's environmental consultant. They're a national company. They have a big office here in the Twin Cities, but they have offices all over the country. And you know, their business livelihood depends on their reputation. And they work on a lot of MPCA projects over the years. So we do not have a concern that the groundwater samples are not representative of the conditions. I would also say too that, you know, we can look at data and kind of know when it makes sense and when it doesn't. The length of the Ford environmental investigation, like I say, it started with us in 2007. Arcadis has been on it the whole time. Because of the largeness of the project and the length of time that it's been operating, there have been so many different Arcadis field staff working on that project. They come and they go, one's there on Wednesday, another one's there on Tuesday. You know, and the results are all consistent. You know, I mean, so there's no red flags there from our perspective.
Okay, so we tell them what to sample, they send out a third party consultant to collect the samples, and they go to a lab. They go to a certified lab, a lab that's under our oversight that has a certain certification. So there's a whole other layer there of separation between the responsible party and the data.
Thanks. Shauna?
This is a question that straddles both the main parcel and Area C. What hazardous waste cleanup was done on the main site, and what are all the Area C possible cleanup alternatives? And some other questions that kind of pull into that is, can it be used for anything other than a parking lot? Is it likely that the industrial waste would be mined and removed? Is it usual to keep waste like this in place?
You would have to remind me there. So somebody was asking what kind of cleanup was done on the main parcel. This actually, I don't know if Bruce is in the audience there, but we had an online email question from Bruce who kind of asked that too about the main parcel. And the reason it comes up is because on the main parcel there was 2 other dumps similar to Area C, but that actually one predated Area C. So the Ford plant started operating in the 20s. Area C wasn't used until about 1940. So in the early days, they were actually disposing of those same wastes on the main parcel. And then they started another one on the main parcel too. It always kind of coalesced into one big area in the end. But those 2 areas were called A and B, go figure. We're left with C here now. So I didn't name them, but that's how they are. And so areas A and B, some of the earlier Ford documents talk about how areas A and B were scooped up earlier in the 1960s and added to Area C. And that was because there was a construction project going on in the mid-1960s. The plant was expanding. They were putting in a railroad loading car. They were expanding a parking lot, and they needed to get that contaminated soil out of the way. So that's kind of partly accurate. They did remove some soil from areas A and B and added to Area C. But they left a whole lot in place, and we know that because we found it when we were cleaning up the main parcel. That was actually one of there was like 4 really large areas of cleanup on the Ford main parcel, and that was one of them. So areas A and B, they were scooped out all the way to bedrock, depth of about 10 to 12 feet, and it was all taken off and shipped off site. And so the wastes were very similar in type, because it's the same kind of waste being disposed, just at different times. The one difference, and I think I alluded to, I was going to make some comment about burning. When it was going on in the main parcel, there was some burning involved too, so they would kind of burn things that were burnable, and then we're left with glass and metal pieces and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, what else was in that question that I need to?
What are possible cleanup alternatives, and can you use it for something other than a parking lot?
Oh, down in the river parcel, you can't actually build down there anymore, and and I think that's more zoning, or I'm not quite sure, it's not a state, it's not a regulation thing, it's not related to contamination, but it's just based on the fact that it's a floodplain, and there's a couple buildings down there now, the old steam plant, which is a really cool building, and the wastewater treatment plant, those are empty. I think there's some availability for reuse if somebody were to want to do something with those existing buildings, but nothing can be built down there anymore. So that's just kind of a zoning floodplain thing. Oh, yeah, and so Sean is asking, can they mine and remove the waste? Well, the waste could only be removed if all the overlying stuff was removed. So removing the parking lot and then removing all the construction fill over it and removing the big concrete debris around it. So that, yeah.
Area C, now it's the Ford Motor Company. And why wasn't it purchased by Ryan? I don't know. There are people from Ryan here that might want to answer that, they might not want to. But Ford is a responsible party, so I believe they're looking at leasing the surface rights, so, you know, you could continue using it as a state fair parking lot, you know, stuff like that, or the solar panel idea, that sort of thing. The other question that kind of relates is, why wasn't this cleanup for Area C or the investigation of it underway with the rest of the Ford site? So when they were doing the cleanup on the Ford site these past few years, why weren't they doing Area C at the same time? And so that's just, you know, the main parcel was getting ready for redevelopment, so that took priority. And there was additional investigation that needed to be done at Area C that didn't have to go on the main parcel. So that's the basic reason, it's just timing, because they're two different scenarios, two different things to track.
I just wanted to, we've been using the term responsible party a lot, and I just want to make sure that we kind of define for those who may not know exactly what we're talking about, what that means. Maybe Hans, you could talk about that.
Responsible party is a term used in the Superfund process. It means you have legal responsibility to respond to the release. It's a simple version, and there's a whole lot more of that. It's very, you know, I said, my opinion, I may be biased because I work in the Superfund program, we have a long history there, but it's a very powerful law. We rarely use the full extent of it, and it has to do with the scope of becoming a responsible party and trying to get out of being a responsible party.
I knew we could use some clarification.
This is a nice grouping of questions, I gotta set them down. It's a comment and a question regarding the value of restoring wetlands or relocating wetlands to the Area C area. And that the wetland restoration would be helped with the removal of the Area C waste material. And then there are some questions that reference, you know, some of the feasibility study options that we might be hearing about in a year or so. So restoring the floodplain, you know, what is the removal cost, and should that be looked at in a bigger picture, and what's better for the floodplain in that area? There's a question here about have wildlife species and mammals and fish been tested, have plants been tested? So take a pause and take a stab at these, and you know, some of these are comments that I think are very valid for the feasibility study input. You know, the 30-day comment period we'll have, and the meetings we'll have, so it's, you know, fair to bring them up here, and we'll pass them along to Ford definitely, but our decisions are risk-based, and so the question about wildlife species and if we've tested them, because we look at ecological risk as well as human health risk, and Ford has not specifically tested birds and fish in this area. The PCA does test fish. Along with MDH, we kind of come up with recommendations for, like, you know, how you can eat one fish from this segment of the river per month, those sorts of things. So they are looked at. The contaminant levels that we're seeing in the groundwater wells aren't rising to any levels of concern where we worry about it accumulating in fish. It's not that type of stuff. So, I'm gonna pass it to Walker while I read this last one, because it's the whole page. It'll take me a second.
Ralph, I'm filling in for Walker. Oh, okay, Emily's got it.
Someone's asking, what does trespass mean here, and what access does the public have to the intended area? I think the important part about the trespassing here is on that south slope of Area C, right adjacent to the walking trail in Hidden Falls Park. There's a fence, it's got barbed wire on the top. To me, it clearly signals you're not supposed to go over there, but it is cut open in, I think, 2 or 3 areas, and you can get to the area, through the river. So, when I'm referring to, trespass, it's really that on the other side of the fence on that south slope.
Thanks. At this point, I'd like to just pause and get a sense of how many people want to, stand up and ask a question. Can we just raise hands for people who want to do that? I just want to get a sense for how many there are. Couple. Okay, if you don't mind, we will get to you, but I'd like to continue with the cards for a bit here since people were kind enough to take the time to write these out for us. You got another group there, Shauna?
There's always more. No, we're getting to the end. It's not that bad, guys. This question talks about restoring native vegetation and wildlife habitat as well. It kind of plays off the other comments and questions that were submitted about that. And just that there's in the greater area of the area C and the Locken Dam #1, that there are hundreds of species of birds that have been observed in that area, and it seems to be a very strategic place from Hidden Falls to Crosby Park and down through some other wetlands south of there near the airport. So almost a migratory area or just a sensitive area. And so it's good to note this. Again, that's kind of a comment for the actual feasibility study and some inputs that need to be considered, because it's not all about cleaning it up or not cleaning it up. It's all about some restoration too. I understand that that's a big concern, so that's something that comes into the community concern category. And so, good comment. And then we have, these all kind of flow into each other, but there's a comment that says, regardless of the content of the pollution, how is it socially responsible to leave a dump site in the Mississippi River Valley and within it a unit of the National Park Service? And so, that's going to be considered as part of the feasibility study too. And the National Park Service is one of our stakeholders. We include them in the process. They're here tonight. So it's not something that's just being pushed aside and not looked at. It's a little bit out of our wheelhouse at the PCA, but it comes into the overall process.
Great. So as I mentioned, the meeting does go until 8 o'clock, but we do want to leave some time for people to talk one-on-one or in small groups with staff that are here. So we'll continue with the questions yet, but then at some point I'll try to gauge, is it okay if we stop this microphone part here and kind of go back to mingling in the room? So, Shauna, have you got another group there, or I could take one of the email questions?
You can take an email.
All right. So, I think this has been touched on before, but a person did email us. I was talking to my friend about the site and the issues around it, and he said he thought he remembered being told that the items that were dumped were, quote, safely disposed of, unquote. So he didn't see what the problem was. Question: were people told that the items were safely disposed of, and is that true?
Well, they didn't hear that from me. So that's kind of two questions in my mind, like, were they safely disposed of at the time, and then what is the current condition? So again, looking back, of course they were not safely disposed at all. I mean, back in that day, I don't think anybody thought anything of it. That's just the way waste were disposed. But looking back, of course they were not safely disposed. When we look at it today and make decisions today, we look at the current situation, and that's why we have the health department do that risk assessment too. So right now, there doesn't seem to be much of a risk to public health or the river, because the fact that it's all covered up and there's not a lot of groundwater contamination that's been identified. Doesn't mean that nothing's gonna be done out there, but it does, it's not like a ticking time bomb kind of thing, so.
This one, that kind of segues to this question.
What do you want me to? How would this waste be properly disposed today if it was newly generated? Yeah, I think Shauna mentioned that already. So nowadays, if that waste was going to be generated now, then it would be taken to be picked up by a licensed contractor, taken to a permitted landfill for disposal, or sometimes it's reclaimed and treated as well. Just kind of depends on the waste. And why shouldn't we do that now, especially given the site's location and the critical area? again, at this stage, when we look back on these sites that predated, waste disposal regulations, we use a risk-based investigation and analysis to make those cleanup decisions.
You got more there.
This might be one for Hans. Since this is not a current Superfund site, but you're talking about Superfund law giving us, protections and assurances, that the waste will be managed if conditions change, how does that play into the future? If it's not a Superfund site now, how can we talk about the Superfund law in the future?
Okay, so when you say Superfund, that's actually a bunch of different things. There's what we call listed Superfund sites. The state has a list of Superfund sites, and it's the federal government. This was delisted from the state list. It doesn't mean there's a change in who's responsible for the scope of the liability. So Superfund's a list of sites. Superfund's state and federal statute about who's responsible, who has to do what the state's authorities are, all of that. That's not changed at all by being on the list or off the list. Okay? And then also there is, or there was in the federal government case, a fund, a backstop, a way to respond to contamination when the entity that is legally responsible is not able to do it. So Superfund absolutely applies in terms of the law and the liability scheme and our authorities and our ability to respond. Being on the list doesn't change that. This site is no longer on the list.
You mentioned that the waste material is encapsulated, but we've been told previously that there is no liner beneath the waste. So how do you consider it encapsulated? That's the question. So yes, true encapsulation would be all sides of the waste, but that's exactly why we're doing the groundwater monitoring, and even at landfills and old dumps where there are liners, we still monitor the groundwater because stuff can leak through the liners. So we're talking about encapsulation from the surface and the sides, because materials can leach when groundwater hits them. They can leach down as the water goes down that column of materials. So we're not using all the right terminology perhaps, but when we're talking about encapsulation, we mean that it's mostly capped. As we know, the south slope is missing some cap material. There is stuff closer to the surface, and we see that in the groundwater wells right next to that area. Because where we do see some low levels of contamination pop up, those are usually the wells we see it in.
I think at this point, I'd like to try to call on a couple of those questioners. There were a couple hands in the back. Maybe we could, yes, sir, and then back there.
If you can come
If you could just stand up, I'll repeat your question.
I sent this in, I'll try to paraphrase it. Climate change projections indicate we're going to have considerably increased intense rainfall events, precipitation events, significantly more flooding, and perhaps unprecedented levels of flooding in coming decades. How is this feasibility study going to address concerns vis-a-vis prospective impacts of climate change?
I'm just going to repeat that question for the benefit of the audio recording we're making. This questioner wonders how climate change and changes in precipitation are going to affect this site and this cleanup.
I have it right here. Sorry, we didn't quite get to it. That is something that's taken into consideration during the feasibility study. The remedy has to be protective during severe weather events. I don't know if they're gonna, in some cases you might plan on like 200-year floods instead of one, that sort of thing. But because the site is located in the floodplain of the river, it's a very legitimate concern and something that will be taken into consideration. Part of that is if the waste material stays in place, the slopes have to be stable enough to withstand that extra water, that harder erosion that happens when you have more volume of water in the river. So it's it's a good comment, it's a good question. It's something we look at a lot of our sites now that maybe it wasn't considered when you know, Superfund first came into effect in the 80s. But it's something we look at now because it happens, hurricanes happen, flooding happens.
So we're all in this line of work because we care about things like that very deeply. So that's true about us. It's also true about the agency. So every program that we have at the agency now is doing these kind of reassessment, refocus, considering what more severe weather would look like for the kind of work that we do. So that also it's no different for this site-specific consideration.
Yeah, another question in the back?
Yeah, right here, I moved.
Yes, sir. Sure.
Just to confuse you. And you're making some statements about, sounds like VTEX volatils, but I mean, I haven't seen anything presented about concentration. So, you know, more specifically, what is the highest level of benzene that you've seen directly under the contamination? What's the highest level of benzene in the down gradient wells closest to the river? And then if there isn't much benzene, I'm assuming the rest is toluene, probably xylene, so those are more common paint solvents. I would think natural attenuation would take care of those unless the levels are extremely high, but I haven't heard what those levels are. And then a comment about treatment, you know, because it's in the unsaturated zone and it's probably permeable. When you can do soil venting, bioventing, you can even burn it out with STAR. There's lots of in situ treatment options. So I guess I haven't heard what the levels are.
I'm just gonna condense that for the audio recording, excuse me. Questioner wondered about what are the concentrations of the VTEX compounds, and they'll explain what that means. And what about, there are ways that you can treat those compounds in soil.
Yeah, so I think your question was groundwater related. So the well that shows the most, actually the only consistent VOC concentrations is the one that's right off the south slope, next to those trenches where the paint waste is closer to the surface. And so that well, I think it's mainly trimethylbenzenes on that one, 300 parts per billion, something like that. So it's actually not very high in the grand scheme of things. So that's about the concentrations. And yeah, and that's like right next to the waste. So the wells that are closer to the river, we don't get those detects.
Okay, so natural attenuation is taking care of it, it sounded like. And what about chromium-6? Have you seen any chromium-6 or just the?
I'm sorry, could you repeat?
Any chromium-6 for the metals?
Um,
From the plating?
He's asking about chromium, which is a metal. There's different species of chromium, the hexavalent chromium he's talking about, which is generally the more toxic. Yes, in the waste samples, not in the groundwater. And just by way of explanation for other folks, you know, the most different kinds of contaminants have different mobility in the environment. The volatile organic compounds, the VTEX compounds that this gentleman was asking about, those are generally the things that leach out of the waste, out of the soil and into the groundwater, and they have better mobility. Metals in general, they like to stay absorbed to soil. They don't really move as much into the groundwater, so we can see those in the soil, in the waste, and really not have them in the groundwater as much, so. Yeah, I can do that. This is a question about thallium. There's been an interesting history of thallium at the Ford site. This could be a long answer, but I'll try to summarize it. So early on in the monitoring wells at Area C, remember there's 10 wells down there, thallium was detected in every single groundwater sample down there on Area C. And it raised some concerns by outside parties because the risk level for thallium is very, very, very low. The data didn't make sense to me. I just actually kind of continuation of what I was just talking about before about the mobility of contaminants. The stuff that we expect to see leaching out of this waste wasn't in those samples. You know, we didn't see the volatile organic compounds that are mobile and leachable. We didn't see those in those samples, but we were seeing the thallium. And thallium wasn't detected in the waste samples that were analyzed. So it just kind of, and it was the same concentration like everywhere. I mean, normally you kind of see a, more like maybe higher concentrations near the waste and then fading off, as you move farther away. So we had this data. I'm looking at it. It doesn't make sense because there wasn't a source. We knew that the industrial waste did not contain thallium because it was tested. The groundwater data is not making sense. So thallium was a little bit new to me. I've been in this field for 30 years and I still learn new things on projects. That's just kind of the fun of working in the environmental field, Every site's different and questions come up and you gotta dig in and do some research. So I started researching thallium, and one thing I found this published article that said that if using this one analytical method, there's like almost 100% chance of getting false positives. What that means is that if you detect it using this one method of groundwater analysis, the data is really not very good. So the first question that you probably ask is, well, why are they using that method? Well, they didn't really, because in sending a sample to the laboratory for analysis, I mentioned that they sampled for 23 metals, right? And that's just a standard list of metals that is requested, so it's called the priority pollutant list. And all the labs know, if you ask for the priority pollutant list, they're going to analyze for these 23 metals. So that's what Ford did. It's a nice grouping of metals. It contains all of the common ones that we see, and it contains some weird ones too that we normally don't see and really wouldn't even ask for. But what the heck, give us the data because you're running it on the lab. So that's why thallium is included in that list of 23 lab analyses. So we get this data back. But if you are truly going to analyze for thallium, that is not the method that you would use, because the method isn't good for thallium. If you want to get good thallium data, you got to use a different analytical method. And so this just kind of talks about some of the complexities of, you can't just look at a number and make a decision. You got to understand what that number means. Is it good data? What's going on? You got to interpret this. So I had Ford change their analytical method for thallium for all the groundwater samples, using this other method that was specifically still doing the 23 list, for all the other metals, but let's kind of validate, is this really good thallium data? So they went and started using this other method, and then it all dropped off. So it was kind of, it was a good, I learned from that, and it was a good question that came up. But we do need to, as we get questions and answer those questions, we kind of have to let the concern go. Because it seems like my perception is that thallium at the Ford site has kind of become an urban myth, and it's a very, very unusual metal. There was another question that came in online that kind of related to this, so I'm just going to answer that now, even though we haven't gotten to it yet. And that's about thallium in glass. So I have said that the industrial waste was sampled for thallium, and it was not there. It's not a contaminant concern in the industrial waste. But the questioner, and this was raised in the past too, not just tonight, but in some previous comments that we had, well, thinking the thallium is a component of glass. And if you do a quick Google, maybe you will find a connection that something says thallium is used in glass making. But this is just a really good lesson in digging down deep. When you see something online, you can't just kind of take the first reference that you see. We have to kind of check into this a little bit more. So the glass that was produced at the Ford plant is very benign. There are no harmful additives in it at all. It's silica sand, it's soda ash, it's some crushed limestone. They melt it, they make glass, they cut it to fit the cars. Some glass, and not all glass is the same. Glass is made for all different purposes, and some glass used in different kind of industries might have some harmful additives to it. So for example, colored glass might have some metals in it that give it the pigment, just like metals are in paint pigments, metals are maybe in colored glass too, to give it that color. Thallium is used in glass production in a very, very specific set of circumstances, and it's really a modern application as well. It's used for glass that's going to be used for, like, say, digital lenses for cameras and for really high-tech medical equipment. And the reason the thallium is added to the glass is because it's maybe more than you want to know, but it increases the refractive index of the glass. So it gives the glass a specific feature that is necessary for that application. Obviously, we don't need colored glass in automobiles, and we don't need this refractive enhancement, for windshield glass. So it's good comments, and sometimes there are harmful additives in glass, but not in the automobile glass that was used for cars. Yeah, we can take your question. Oh,
First, there
sorry.
was a gentleman over here who had his hand up first. So one here, one there, and then we'll see if we can wrap things up, and then one over there. Yes, sir.
This won't be so technical, but I used to work at the Ford plant when it made the larger pickup truck. And I really remember the distinct smell there. It was a kind of an oily smell, and you know how smells trigger memories? And it was kind of oily, not really awful, but it just was the smell. When you went home, it was in your clothes. So I've lived in the neighborhood for over 25 years. I use River Road all the time, bicycle, walking, motorcycles, cars with the windows down. And there's one spot on River Road near the northwest corner of the larger area. I'll drive in for a small space, I'll smell the smell. And it's like, oh man, I just remember putting those rear axles on the trucks. And I used to smell it a lot more often. And like on a warm summer day, I'd smell it maybe 75% of the time. It's just one small spot. But when they did the cleanup, I thought, oh, maybe I won't smell it ever again. But I still smell it a little. It's maybe 10% now or less, but it's still there. And what the question is then, were those test borings, could those contaminants come underneath River Road and be in that area where the hiking and bicycle trails are? And maybe what was that smell? Or you don't, maybe nobody would know. But has that been tested outside of the Ford site area?
Yeah, if I could just repeat for the audio here, this gentleman worked at the Ford plant, remembers a particular smell, an oily smell, which he still smells sometimes in a very specific area of the River Road. Were you asking also, sir, if the test borings could have been a conduit for movement of contaminants?
No, I smelled it way before the test boring.
Okay.
Yeah, for 25 years I smelled that smell.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, maybe afterwards, if you want to show me on a map, kind of where
Oh,
you're
sure.
thinking of,
Yeah.
but if I'm northwest, so, for Ford Parkway, are you talking about?
No, River Road,
River Road,
Mississippi
okay.
River Boulevard.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. There was a really large petroleum cleanup in that area. And the soil was taken down in a very large area, all the way down to bedrock.
Yeah.
So the soil contamination is all gone, but that doesn't mean that there's not some contamination in the shallow groundwater that remains, from that, before the soil was taken off. So that groundwater, it's kind of going towards the river and stuff, but yeah, I don't know if that could explain the smell. Maybe, yeah, I was gonna say maybe there's like some storm sewer connection, some leakage into a storm sewer or something like that, but yeah, there was, right in that area, now that I think about it, there was a collapsed storm sewer. This was a couple of years ago. The city discovered right in that corner that a storm sewer had collapsed, and there was some flooding going on, and I wonder if it's got something to do with that. It's subsequently been fixed, but it was kind of right in that area as well. Who knows, yeah.
Okay.
We had one question over here, then one there, then we got a couple here. We've got 25 minutes left, and I do want to make sure that we have some time for people to speak one-on-one, so if we could maybe go for another 5-10 minutes, I don't know. I know we won't be able to get to all the questions, but over here, and then there, and then in the middle here. Who had the question over here? Did you have your hand up earlier, ma'am?
I did, yes.
Okay, yes, what's your question, please?
Why is Ford glass that you find down on the slopes under, below the plant, why is it blue?
Question for the audio. Why is the Ford glass that you see down on the slopes, why is that blue?
I do not know. I mean, it could be a weird weathering or something,
No, we used to go collect it back in the sixties for little, like, things to put on your coffee table. It's kind
yeah,
of beautiful aqua blue. It looks almost like a gemstone, very common down there.
okay.
At least in the sixties, it was common down there.
Yeah, I haven't seen any of that, but, I don't know, I'll check into that.
It's very full of thallium. I think I'm gonna throw mine.
I don't think so.
And then the gentleman over here, sir, by the wall.
Since area A and B have been removed, is it correct that area C would be removed if it was more accessible?
Yeah, for the audio, since areas A and B on the main parcel have been removed, is it correct that area C would be removed if it was more accessible? I would say yes.
So, follow up, why not have it removed while Ford is still an economically viable?
So why not have it removed while Ford is still economically viable? I guess for these old sites, we do use a risk-based, we remove things that need to be removed if it's causing a risk to people or the river. Other than that, if it does stay in place, they are continually responsible for it, ongoing monitoring. Hans' comments about the long-term maintenance and Superfund liability kick in, so.
Then we have some questions in the middle here. I'm not sure who was first. Yes, sir, in the front here.
Yeah, my name's Jim Gimper. You look at the M on McGoffin up there, it's basically where I live. If you go west, about halfway to where it says Mississippi River Road, they've been digging and scouring there. I think it's been Bolander and Sons. There's 2 large ponds there, right in the middle there, and they're both about 1 acre, and they're joined. And it's probably part of the new creek bed feature, the water feature, but it shows where the water level is. They've been there year-round now, ever since they dug that area out, at the same time that they were cleaning up the railroad tracks. But that area kind of sits above area C. Why wouldn't the groundwater be perking down from and these are 2 large ponds, like I said, it's about 2 acres in total. Why wouldn't they be perking down, just going west and scouring out area C and bringing pollutants down, further down the river? Because it's logical, they've got to perk somewhere, because the levels do go up and down. I've watched them, I live right by.
Can you condense and summarize that for the audience?
So I just want to make sure I understand the question. So are you talking about
Right
in
in
this area?
Yeah, where they put 2 large ponds and a little bit west.
So on the Ford side?
Right there, yes.
On the Ford side, yeah, those are 2 stormwater ponds that Ford constructed during its demolition and earth moving activities. So they're required to kind of capture that stormwater,
Sure.
have the sediment filter out and everything before it's discharged.
But their levels do change during the summer especially. They do go down, so they're perking.
Yeah, sure. I mean,
Somewhere.
anytime you have a stormwater pond or precipitation, that water sinks into the ground and either recharges the water table. Sometimes it emerges as springs or seeps along the bluff. So I don't know exactly where it comes out. We've walked this many times. In some places along the bluff, there are some significant springs, not in this area, but especially like further to towards Minneapolis and stuff. There are springs that are flowing all the time. Along here, there's just some seeps that aren't really flowing. I mean, the best time to see them is actually in the winter, because you can see like a little, ice stalagmites and stalactites, that kind of thing. So there's water dripping out of there, and it's freezing, and then this icicle just keeps kind of growing. So that's the best way to see where the seeps are. We see that, especially like kind of up in this area. If something is coming out here, it would be coming out right at the top. This is, there's an elevation difference here between the road and the top of area C, and just the way the bedrock stratigraphy is. You would be able to see it in this area. You wouldn't be able to see it here. But the bottom line is, we look at the groundwater data. So if there was significant infiltration and seepage that was coming into area C and filtering down through the waste, that would be a source of water leaching through the waste that the parking lot doesn't prevent, because as you were saying, it would be coming in like kind of underneath that parking lot. And we just don't see that having an impact, so.
If we could, there was one more question in the back. And if it's all right with people, I'd like to end it after that so that we can have time to speak one-on-one. If somebody is really concerned that they did not get their question answered, let us know, but let's take one more question and then see how we're doing.
Thank you. Whitney Clark with Friends of the Mississippi River. We urged you to do this meeting tonight, so I just wanted to express our gratitude to you for doing it. As you can see, the neighbors have a great interest in this topic. Been a bunch of really interesting legal questions and scientific questions asked and answered tonight. What I'm hearing a lot in this room tonight and from our members and advocates is more of an ethical question. We know that some unknown quantity, a large quantity but an unknown quantity of hazardous waste is buried in this location. It's been there for a long time. We know from the monitoring that there's continuing amounts that are leaching into the groundwater and eventually into the river. But those concentrations are mostly, so far as we know, and we're still investigating, below the state standards for the health risk limits for groundwater or surface water. So my question, and I think one, and I don't think you necessarily can answer this tonight, you could take a crack at it, but I think it's one that hangs over this whole investigation and will be present in the discussions about the feasibility study, is if the waste is, or some of the waste, is allowed to remain in place in perpetuity because the costs are deemed to be perhaps too high to make Ford remove it because the concentrations are below the health risk limits. Is it right to allow an unknown quantity of waste to bleed out into a national park and our great river in perpetuity until it's all gone? Is that the right thing to do?
So just to summarize again for the audio, and this will be our last question unless we have strong objection to that. Mr. Clark from the Friends of the Mississippi River said basically, is it right? It might, if we wind up leaving the waste in place forever, is that the right thing to do? It's an ethical question.
I'll mention something, and then it looks like Hans was getting up too, so, well, we can both take it. You know, there's not a person in this room that wouldn't like to have that thing completely gone. I mean, you know, the people you're looking at up here would like to have it gone too. So that is a very good question. It's a good point. Our process does use this risk-based process with all of the sites we look at. For better or worse, that is how we make our decisions. Hans, what would you add to this mix?
Yeah, we understand that. We totally understand. It just doesn't feel right, and we get that. There is a framework we operate within. There's reasons for that. If we just sort of disregard the framework when we don't like it, then the whole system's unstable, and the whole thing collapses. We're unable to do the work we need to do at multiple sites across the state. So it's really important that we have a structure that responds to the concerns, but also is stable and predictable, and that it's based in law. So, yes, everything you said, yes, and it's good to hear that feedback.
One more question. I assume, I'm following with Whitney, but can we have a show of hands? I assume everybody in here wants it all gone. I mean, is there any, do everybody agree with you? Just all it all out?
Thank you.
Again, thank you for everybody. I must say you have been a very civil audience. I've done a lot of these meetings where the audiences were not nearly so civil, so we greatly appreciate that. We have staff from PCA and from the Department of Health who will be in the back there, willing to hang around and talk to you until they kick us out. Thanks again.
Here. Oh, my.